welcome to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum, Oregon's premier public affairs forum. I'm Charity Fain, Executive Director of City Club, and I would like to welcome you all, those of you here at the Governor Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB or KBPS radio, or watching on Portland Community Media's CityNet 30. Thank you for joining City Club today on Friday, December 3rd. In consideration of those sitting close to you and those in the radio and television audiences, I ask everyone in the room who has not already done so to please silence your cell phones. Today, we will learn about the politics of Oregon's water, on how water sourcing, usage, and laws impact our state. But first, some announcements. I'd like to start by recognizing a few new City Club members. Would Donna Maddox, Christine Hine, and Karen Maurice please stand and be recognized? I'd also like to thank our media partners, including Oregon Business Magazine, and at this time would like to offer our appreciation to the Friday Forum corporate sponsors whose generous financial support make these luncheons possible. Please join me in offering our sincere appreciation to AARP Oregon, the law firm of Barron Liebman, the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, and PGE. If your company or firm would like to be a City Club sponsor, you can contact me after the event, see City Club staff at the back of the room, or call the office. As the members in the room will know, the City Club's annual fund is in full swing. Donations to the annual fund play a significant role in supporting City Club's civic engagement efforts and are critical to the life of the club. If you have already given to the annual fund this year, we would like to take a few moments to say thank you. So please rise and stand for a round of applause. Those of you who have given to the annual fund, I know you're in here. Thank you. So those of you who did not stand, annual fund donations help support Friday forums, including the election season debates that just finished, addresses from political leaders, and topics ranging from economics to ecology. If you've enjoyed this past season of Friday forums, please support their continuation today. And remember, you don't need to be a member to make a donation. You'll find envelopes on the table, and City Club staff in the back of the room even have a credit card machine where they can process your credit card payment. You can also go on our website at pdxcityclub.org and make a contribution. Thank you so much for supporting City Club. And now on to today's program. Living in a city bisected by rivers and drenched by nearly 3 feet of rain each year, it's easy for Portlanders to take water for granted. But doing so would be a mistake. Oregon as a whole is more dry than wet, and long before the Columbia River runs through Portland, it travels through the arid landscapes of northeastern Oregon. Agricultural, industrial, and environmental groups have waged battle during the last 2 sessions over how much water to withdraw from Oregon's rivers. Today, our speaker will discuss where and how Portland gets its water, and the impact this has on Oregon's agriculture, land use planning, and environmental protection efforts. She will also outline how the politics of water affect economic development across the state, nation, and globe. Janet Neuman is a law professor at Lewis and Clark Law School. She joined their faculty in 1992 after serving as the director of the Oregon Department of State Lands. She served as the law school's first associate dean of faculty from 2005 through 2008, and currently co-directs the law school's Natural Resources Law Institute. Professor Neuman also serves as senior counsel to the law firm of Tonkin Torp, consulting with the firm's environmental and natural resources practice group, with an emphasis on water law matters. Professor Neuman is on the board of the Freshwater Trust, a nonprofit conservation group, and is past president of the Oregon Water Trust, a nonprofit working to restore in-stream flows through water rights acquisition. She also served on the Clinton administration Western Water Policy Review Advisory Commission. And now, please join me and welcome Professor Neuman to the podium.
Thank you, Charity, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming, especially after a season of political debates. I'm pleased to see so many people here to learn about water today. And I'm very pleased to see some of my former students out there in the audience as well, so welcome to you. I'm going to talk to you about my favorite subject, water, and it might not be your favorite by the time I finish, but I hope it will make it to your top 10, because it is really important, and it's a lot more interesting and intricate and dramatic than you might think. First of all, I'm going to start with a little snapshot of Portland's water, since we're all right here in this metropolitan area. Then I'll talk a little bit more broadly about our water future, including this aspect of water politics, water scarcity, water wars, water is the new oil, all of these things you've probably heard about. So first of all, Portland's water. As Charity said in her introduction, it's sometimes hard to get too concerned about water here in Portland because we're crisscrossed by these rivers, and we have more than 3/4 of the year it's usually raining. And these rivers aren't just any rivers, they're big ones. And I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but the Columbia River is the 4th largest river by volume in the United States. Averages about 265,000 cubic feet per second of flow where it discharges into the Pacific Ocean. And for those of you who aren't familiar with water measurement, if you imagine a box 1 foot on each side, that's a cubic foot. If you imagine one of those moving past you 1 a second, that's a cubic foot per second. So Columbia, you have to imagine 265,000 of those moving past you during 1 second. The Willamette then, of course, joins the Columbia here in Portland, or just outside of Portland, and it contributes about 12 to 15% of the Columbia River's flow. It averages more than 32,000 cubic feet per second where it comes into the Columbia at Kelly Point Park. Before it gets here, the Willamette has gathered up other rivers you may know and love, the Mackenzie, the Clackamas, just to name 2 of its tributaries. And of course, when you're talking about water, averages never give you the full picture. The Willamette rolled into Portland during the flood of 1996 with about 420,000 cubic feet per second, so more than the average flow of the Columbia. And the highest flows on the Columbia have exceeded 1 million cubic feet per second. So that's multiples of their average flows during high flood years. And then, of course, there's our legendary rain. And by the way, I figured I might be in for a tough audience today when the announcement went out about my talk, and I got someone sending an email quibbling with my figures saying that Portland doesn't average 40 inches of rain a year, it's only 36. Well, we're both right. And if that person is here, hats off to them for knowing their detailed water factoids, which is not that common. As measured at the airport, the average annual precipitation from 1971 to 2000 is just over 37 inches a year. So that's all precipitation, rain, and snow. But measured downtown and looking at a longer period of time, 1872 to 2009, the average is just over 42 inches a year. And these figures are from the National Weather Service. Either way, it's a lot of rain, and we can certainly agree about that. So the rivers and the rain account for the water all around us. Do you feel soggy yet? Although today is not a soggy day. But what about the water we drink, the water that's in your glass on the tables? In Portland, our drinking water doesn't come directly from the Columbia or the Willamette River, although other communities around the region do get their water from those sources. But it does come from the rain. Most of you probably already know, especially if you get your water directly from the Portland Water Bureau, that it comes from the Bull Run watershed on the flanks of Mount Hood. But there are a few things about Bull Run water that you may not know and that I'd like to tell you about. And these have to do with the history and legal status, the science of the Bull Run water supply, and third, the reach, if you will, of Bull Run water, just how much work it actually does. Even if you don't drink Bull Run water, the things I'm going to tell you are in many ways transferable to other municipal water supplies, to the broader issues that I'm going to be talking about. So bear with me for a moment while I do tell you a little bit more about Bull Run. And that's what you're drinking here today, so you should know about it anyway. First of all, the history and legal status. The first Bull Run water flowed into town in 1895 after about a 10-year development process, including building 24 miles of pipeline, constructing the Mount Tabor and the Washington Park reservoirs, which have become controversial because they're uncovered, And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But before that, before 1895, Portland's water was primarily from wells, just individual wells put down around town, and several creeks, and even from the Willamette. And it was not clean and healthy water. I mean, there was a fair amount of waterborne disease in those early days. And that's one of the reasons why the city of Portland and the sort of founding fathers, and they were mostly fathers, not mothers at that time, went to look for a new source of water and came up with the Bull Run. We can give credit to a man named Isaac Smith. He was an engineer. He was actually active in the Confederate Army, but he came out here and did sort of engineering works after the Civil War. But we can give him credit for the foresight and the engineering. And right off the bat, people told him that he couldn't get the water all the way to Mount Tabor, for instance, with just gravity flow. But he had done his homework, he'd done his field work, and he'd done his calculations, and he knew that in fact, he could do it. There were a couple of very important legal developments about this same time that were critical, though, to the project's success. In 1892, President Benjamin Harrison set aside the Bull Run watershed as a federally protected forest reserve. And many of you probably don't know the history of the National Forest Service, but the origins of the Forest Service had a lot to do with protecting water supplies coming down from forest headwaters. So this was one of the federally protected forest reserves that was designated in the late 1800s. Later, the Bull Run watershed became part of the Mount Hood National Forest and was combined with some other wooded lands up there. But even ever since, it has been federally protected in some way, or protected in some ways by federal law, because of its significance as the city of Portland's water supply. It's protected from at least rampant timber cutting. It might not be protected entirely. It's protected from development. And this hasn't necessarily been easy. It's not something that the federal government has just acquiesced in. It's taken some battles. The city of Portland has done battle within the Forest Service, at the administrative level, in Congress, and in the courts to keep federal protections in place or to enhance federal protections. And many of you may be familiar with a man named Dr. Joseph Miller, who was around until not too many years ago, and he was one of the most dedicated citizen activists in Portland, dedicating his energy as a retired doctor to protecting the Bull Run water supply. He used to send out letters. I used to be on his mailing list. I got hundreds of letters from Dr. Miller. I'm sure some of you did too. But he was instrumental in continuing to hound the Forest Service and even going to the courts to make sure that the Bull Run watershed was protected, relatively protected, to keep the clean, fresh water flowing down to Portland. There was a move at one point during Bull Run's history to change its name because people thought that Bull Run just didn't conjure up this lovely view of drinkable water, and somebody suggested, Rose City Run and other things, but didn't go anywhere. And basically the people who were working on that were told by the city folks, get a life, or the equivalent of that back in that age. Spend your energy on something more important. So that went by the wayside. Another important legal development, though, that's critical to the success of the Bull Run watershed as our water supply is that the state legislature, by statute, gave the city of Portland a legal water right to the Bull Run and Little Sandy rivers for the municipal supply. Again, about 100 years ago, or over 100 years ago. Having a specific legal water right to this source of supply for the city, in the city of Portland's name, is critical in a state like Oregon, which follows the prior appropriation system of water law. And that system it's somewhat complicated, it's somewhat arcane, it's still the system we have with a lot of tweaks to it, but it's essentially a first in time, first in right system, legal system. And in a highly oversimplified description or summary, this means that whoever first appropriates the water, diverts the water from a natural water source and puts it to productive use, acquires the superior legal right to that water, regardless of whether they own the land where the water's found, regardless of how far they take it, None of those things particularly matter. The senior appropriator prevails over later comers in times of shortage. And in times of shortage in the western United States come fairly frequently, even in relatively wet places like Oregon. At certain times of year, in certain regular cyclical periods, there are water shortages. So having a protected senior or relatively senior water right is a very important thing. You can imagine that cities that have grown more recently, such as Bend or Redmond, places like that, they're in a disadvantaged position because they are not necessarily going to have senior protectable legal water rights that are going to enable their municipal development. So they're looking for water rights from other sources. Okay, I said the history and legal basis is one of the things I wanted you to know about Bull Run that you might not have known already. The science is another thing. Bull Run is primarily fed by rain, not by snowmelt, and that will become important when I talk about climate change a little bit later. Most importantly, though, the water comes from a largely intact, natural, relatively underdeveloped, and relatively protected watershed. In fact, if you wanted to say, on a nice day, hey kids, let's jump in the car and drive up to Mount Hood and see where our water comes from, you probably have different kids than I do if you could get away with that, but you can't do that because the watershed has restricted access. There are locked gates on the roads, there are no trespassing signs on posted boundaries. The Water Bureau does give tours occasionally, and I have to mention that Jewel Lansing, who's in the audience today, took me on a private tour with one city employee many years ago to the Bull Run watershed, and I'd recommend signing up for one of the Park Bureau tours if you can, or the Water Bureau tours, because it's a gorgeous place, and it's the only way you can get there. Now, the reason for the restricted access, obviously, is to protect the area from contamination. And that's a good thing because we do have a phenomenally clean system of drinking water in this city. In fact, when the system first went online in 1895, very soon after, the local health commissioner credited the fresh, clean supply of Bull Run water with a dramatic decrease in the death rate from some waterborne diseases. So that pre-1895, pre-Bull Run water that had been polluted and not so healthy was replaced with this relatively pristine source that really made a difference in local public health. In fact, a healthy, forested, functioning, protected watershed is a thing of beauty. And I don't mean just aesthetically, although it's also that, but functionally. It performs what's called an ecosystem service of producing and providing drinking water. You don't need any complicated, expensive, man-made infrastructure to produce clean, ready-to-drink water. You don't need a desalination plant. You don't need a high-tech filtration and treatment plant. You just protect the watershed and its vegetation and its functions, and the water will keep coming, day after day, year after year. The forest helps capture it, the ground cover helps filter it and store it and send it into the streams over time, and we just need to capture it and bring it downhill, essentially, to Portland. Now, I just want to put a little sidebar here. Recently, the city of Portland has been in somewhat of a dispute with the Environmental Protection Agency at the federal level because the Portland water has been very minimally treated over the years. It is very clean. We have these open reservoirs. We don't add much to it before it's sent to your tap. And there has been some pressure by the EPA to add some treatment options. And Portland has sort of been on the losing end of that dispute. They've been trying to prove to the EPA that, in fact, it's clean enough the way it is. But we are going to have to start adding some treatment, but we've been incredibly lucky. And of course, it's not all luck because, as I mentioned, we have our predecessors to thank for having the vision to put this watershed protection in, or to nail down the source of Portland's water in the Bull Run watershed, and then to put the necessary protections in place, and in terms of the ongoing vigilance of many citizens and city folks to protect the watershed over time. Some other municipalities have not been so lucky or visionary, and I'll just give you a couple of examples. Atlanta has had to replace its water supply about 8 times over the years because of either encroaching development that's limited the usefulness of their municipal water source, or pollution or other sources of contamination. Those things have made their water source, their city water source, unusable on 8 different occasions, and they've had to go seek out additional sources. And right now, they're actually in a battle with the neighboring states of Alabama and Florida, or Georgia's in a battle with Alabama and Florida over partially over Atlanta's water supply. New York is another example. New York has a similar situation to Portland in that a lot of its water comes from the mountains upstate. They were also faced with the necessity to treat their water in order to get better water quality. They were going to have to spend over $600 million to put a treatment plant in place. And they realized that it would be cheaper for them to go buy up land in the Catskills primarily, to protect the source and the headwaters of some of their municipal supply. It's cheaper to go buy land. It was cheaper to buy conservation easements. It was cheaper to go out and cut deals with the local governments in some of these headwater areas than it would be to build this $600+ million treatment plant. So they've started looking at the protected watershed ecosystem service model of providing their city water as well, but they had to sort of backtrack and do it after the fact, whereas we've been much luckier to have that set up in the first place. This model can be replicated, and in fact it is replicated already across the state. By law, Bend has the rights to the Tumalo Creek watershed, Pendleton has the North Fork of the Umatilla, Medford has Butte Creek in the Rogue River Basin, and this ecosystem service watershed management approach will only become more important going forward. Okay, the third thing I said I wanted to tell you about about Bull Run is the reach of the Bull Run water, or just how hard it works. And I also promised I was going to go beyond Portland, so I'm going to start doing that right now. Bull Run is not just Portland's water. Through interagency agreements and wholesale contracts, it actually provides water way beyond the Portland city limits. And in fact, when you include both retail and wholesale water service, the Portland Water Bureau serves about 1/4 of the entire state's population. That's a significant amount, more than 884,000 people in a 3-county service area that totals 225 square miles. The first wholesale customer was back in 1912, and it was the city of Gresham. There are a number of other significant regional suppliers. I mean, Portland isn't the only one that supplies the whole metropolitan area. In addition to getting some of the water from Portland, some of these other areas or other communities also tap the Tualatin River, Clackamas River, the Trask River, which of course drains off in the other direction toward the ocean, wells, and so forth and so on. Small creeks, all kinds of different supplies. So the region's water supply, if you look at sort of the economic engine of the Portland metropolitan region, the region's water supply is made up of many separate but interrelated moving parts. Numerous suppliers both share and compete for the local natural supplies of water. The water sources, both above and below ground, of course, follow natural laws and natural boundaries. The water goes where it wants to go according to its watershed. There's a connection, sometimes tight and sometimes a little bit more extenuated between surface water and groundwater, but all these natural laws are operating in the way that water moves through the system. But governmentally, of course, we manage the water along pretty arbitrary, unnatural lines, with dozens of public agencies, public and private entities, often with competing needs. I mean, they're often competing with each other, and of course, because they compete for economic development in their communities, that puts an additional pressure on winning certain things locally. So when I talk about the Bull Run as this sort of nice contained thing of beauty, that's only part of the story. It's sort of part of this messier, bigger jigsaw puzzle. This isn't the way we design the system if we could start over. I mean, with the understanding of watershed management and ecosystem services and drinking water protection that we have now, we would probably do things much differently. We would replicate the Bull Run model across the metropolitan area, and we wouldn't have all these competing individual governance units. But we can't start over. So barring any kind of major reorganization, all of these individual public and private suppliers are going to continue to do their best to maintain their current supplies, to find new sources, and to continue providing clean, reliable, cost-effective water into the future. And the regional economy, and indeed the whole state's economy, depends on their efforts, just as it depends on supplies of usable land, qualified labor, and other raw materials. You often hear the debate or the insistence on the importance of buildable land or developable land. You don't as often hear about developable water supplies or usable water supplies. It's just as important a raw material. It's just as big an economic driver as any of those other things. If you think about it, every household throughout the state needs probably a few hundred gallons of water a day just for domestic use. And that, of course, has to be clean, fresh, potable water. And if you think about the places around our state that have had some tremendous growth pressure, now it's been diminished a little bit by the economic developments of the last couple of years, but still, we have a state that has some tremendous growth pressure in Central Oregon and Eastern Oregon, even in the Valley as well. So thinking about each household needing a couple hundred gallons a day of fresh water, that's a tremendous need. A single silicon wafer plant requires about 2 to 4 million gallons a day. I mean, the high-tech industry needs clean, reliable sources of water, sometimes even cleaner than it needs to be to drink. That's equivalent, a single plant is equivalent in demand to about a city of about 40 or 50,000 people. Siltronic is the top commercial water user on the City of Portland system. Other major industries in the state, besides the high-tech business, include healthcare, educational institutions, manufacturing, food processing, tourism. All of those require plenty of clean and often drinkable water. And then there's irrigated agriculture, which doesn't require drinkable water, but in fact, it needs the most water of all throughout the state. Agriculture actually uses about 80% of the water in the state. Of the water use in the state goes to agriculture. Even right close to home, I mean, if you look at the 3 most urbanized counties, Multnomah, Washington, Clackamas, they still account for 20% of the state's farm production. So this isn't a east versus west issue. It's an integrated issue throughout the state. So given all these different and important uses, what does the water future look like? Well, the old way to calculate future needs for water was to take the population and the projected population and existing amounts of use per capita and existing manufacturing and farming activities, and then just multiply it. Okay, here's what we're using now, here's how much we're going to grow, here's what we need in the future. This method really doesn't make sense anymore for a couple of reasons. One is climate change, because climate change affects both supply and demand for water. And the other reason is because of the completely untapped potential for demand management. We have allowed people to just get whatever water they thought they needed and not have to necessarily pay the price of that water. So these are two things that are going to change, that change the water future from the water past. Climate change, I mean, I know you've heard tons about it. There have been a few articles in the paper just the last couple of days and on OPB and so forth. But I can't be extremely specific about what it's going to do to the water supply, but it will change the water system. We don't know exactly how, but we expect less of our precipitation to come as snow statewide. Now remember I said Bull Run is a rain-fed system, so there's we're not as dependent on snowmelt for our drinking water as many other communities around the West are, but many other communities are. So we're going to expect more precipitation as rain, less as snow, both more floods and more drought. Now how can that be? Well, that can be because the precipitation will be more concentrated at certain times during the year. Big storm events, big flood flows, and then also periods of drought. There was an article in the paper just a couple of days ago with quoting Phil Mote from the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute at Oregon State, talking about some of these things. He said, well, people want me to tell them, should I build, how big should I build the culverts on this road? Or, very specific questions. He said, I can't answer those questions. I can just say that the whole system of water supply as we know it is going to change. So we have this uncertainty built into our future water needs. And at the same time, water demands, and so our water supply is changing, at the same time our water demands are going to be changing. Because whenever you alter people's use of, or people's temperature, the average temperature, you're going to have increased demands for water. So climate change will bring increased demands for irrigation water, probably increased demands for urban water as well. In fact, the city of Portland estimated that they looked forward and said, basically looking at growth and a little bit of what we can save by conservation, but looking forward to the growth expected, we're going to need 40 million gallons a day of increased water supply, just due to population growth. And then they said, we're going to need another 20 million gallons a day because of climate change. And that's sort of broken down between decreased supply and increased demand. So, a full half of the demands, of the necessary water going forward is attributed to climate change just by the Portland Water Bureau. Now, the other thing that makes our water future different than our water past is this untapped potential for demand management. We have only begun to scratch the surface of conservation in the water area. The city of Portland has had a conservation plan in place, or program in place, for only, I think, about 20 years, and it's largely voluntary and educational. They go out and speak to school groups, they talk to different community groups, they talk to housing suppliers, they provide, low-flow toilet information, all those kinds of things. None of that is directly affecting how much water people can get, except on a voluntary basis. One of the untapped features of water conservation or demand management is pricing. Those of you who get your water from Bull Run, you do pay a water bill, right? You do actually pay a tiered water bill. So if you use a certain amount of water, you pay one amount. If you use more, you get charged a little more for those additional units. The additional charges, however, are mostly driven by the sewer costs. Because of the tremendous rebuild or re-engineering of the combined sewer overflow system in Portland, there's a lot of capital investment going into the sewer costs. And that's being, the charge for that is being recouped on the water bill. So the more you flush, the more you pay. It's not that you're actually paying for the water. And in most instances, municipal supplies, agricultural supplies, what people who use the water pay for is the delivery system, not the water itself. Now, if you go out and buy, a bottle of water down at Starbucks or someplace, you're going to pay a couple bucks for, not very much water. If you compare that to your water bill, it's a tremendous difference. We get water incredibly cheaply in this country. Increasing, actually putting a price signal on water and increasing the price of water does motivate people and businesses to use less. There's just no way around that. And that's certain. We've seen that with gasoline, we've seen that with oil. Putting a price signal in place does help people think, oh, do I really need that much water, or do I need clean water? Can I use gray water? Can I do this a little bit differently? And we're going to see some of that pricing. It's extremely controversial, but I definitely think that water pricing is going to be part of the water conservation picture going forward. And even the delivery systems are going to start charging more. There was just an article in the Oregon Business magazine recently about the Portland water rates and how they've gone up 43% in the last 3 years, and they might double again in the next 5. Remember when I said that Siltronic was the the biggest commercial water user on the Portland system, their water bill could increase by a couple $1 million in the next 5 years. That's one of the highest demands for clean water is the high-tech industry. So as these changes occur, we're going to see much more looming water politics, water wars. I mean, I use that a little bit loosely. But there is going to be intensifying competition for a more uncertain supply. I mean, it may not be a scarce resource any more than it is now. The amount of water in the system, in the hydrologic system on the planet is what's there. I mean, you don't make any more. The only way you can make more water is by desalinating the ocean, but all the water's there. It's cycling through the hydrologic cycle. So the issue is going to be, where are there developable supplies, and how is that changed by climate change? So what kinds of competition, what kinds of water wars and water politics are you going to see? Well, we're seeing this already. Ag and urban use. Those are considered fights, around the West, even around Oregon. Ecological uses, in-stream uses. I mean, both ag and urban use divert water and use it consumptively. In-stream uses, which includes fisheries, ecological uses, but also hydropower, those require water in stream. Right now, Oregon's in the process of drafting its first state water plan. We're one of only 2 Western states, the other one is Alaska, that doesn't have a state water plan. The legislature, last time around, required that one be done, although it's not called a plan, it's called an integrated water resources strategy. And these fights are playing out in that context already. We have people who say the need is to build more dams and more storage projects. We need more water, reliable water for agriculture and for municipalities. You have other entities in the process who are saying, we first need to protect some in-stream flows, and then we'll talk about how we're going to allocate the water for consumptive uses. This is not going to be an easy process to come to some consensus about these issues. Another thing that I haven't even mentioned at all yet is the challenges that are coming with new water pollutants. I mean, I've been talking mostly about water quantity. Water quality is also changing these days. We've got this massive system in place, both state and federal, for dealing with the pollutants we knew about 20 years ago, or more than that, 30, 40 years ago. Now we're confronting the fact that our system hasn't captured pollutants that we're now finding in our water supply, such as pharmaceuticals, caffeine, hormone disruptors, all those kinds of things. So this is why people say, don't flush your old medications down the toilet. You don't want it to go out into the sewer. You'll be happy to know that the tests that are done on the Portland water supply found a little bit of ibuprofen in one sample, but nothing to worry about. So, but that's a whole source of water controversy and water issues that we haven't even touched upon. Okay, some of the other politics and other competition: land use, water use. Land use control has been very controversial in this state. It's also been there's a strong system in place for land use control. That is not well connected with water management. 2 different agencies deal with land use, water use. There are places where they come together, but they are not integrated in the way that they need to be. And here's one example. The state statutes in Oregon provide for what are called exempt wells. Anybody can go out and build a residence. Now, obviously, you have to comply with the land use rules. But if you can comply with the land use rules, you can drill an individual well to provide you and up to 6 other, or not 6 necessarily, but you and a few other residences with well water, and that's completely exempt from the first in time, first in right water right system. So if you get enough straws into the aquifer, you've got some significant withdrawal. And yet, if each of those straws is small enough, 15,000 gallons a day, which is actually a heck of a lot of water, it doesn't need to go through the water right system. So you have urban development, subdivisions, extra urban and rural development that are outside the water rights management system. You also have the whole intersection of ecosystem services that I mentioned before, where if you're trying to protect watersheds for drinking water supplies or other ecosystem services, you don't want them immediately paved over and developed with urban development, because then you've lost your capture, your flood storage, your filtration services. I mentioned that groundwater and surface water are often tightly connected in terms of the hydrologic cycle, but we don't fully manage those as connected resources as well. All of these areas are going to be affected by the uncertainty of climate change, but they're also areas where we're going to have to tighten up our management in order to deal with the uncertainties coming and the competition coming down the pipe. Upstream, downstream. Charity in her introduction mentioned the idea that, you know, before this great giant Columbia River flows through Portland, it's been the subject of legislative contests the last couple of sessions in eastern Oregon, where farmers in the Umatilla Basin have been trying to force the State Water Resources Agency to issue more water rights out of the Columbia for them to use in irrigated agriculture. Of course, when it comes down here, you think, well, there's plenty of water, isn't there? Well, think of what the plenty of water does. It runs the hydroelectric system, it feeds the fisheries, it does lots of other things besides irrigation. I said one thing about bottled water. I just want to mention that bottled water and, more generally, privatization of water supplies and water sources is a huge issue coming down the pike. Bottled water is the single biggest increase in supermarket shelf space in the last few years. It's phenomenal how much bottled water has taken over the market. If you think about it, in Portland, you really don't need to drink bottled water. I mean, Bull Run water is perfectly good. All over the country, though, companies are going around tapping into either springs, groundwater sources, or other surface water sources to feed the bottled water market. And some of those sources are not well regulated by state water management agencies. Okay, I want to end with a couple of comments about global water issues. I've been trying to work my way up from Portland all the way to the world here. And I'll use as a segue just this comment that I saw in a press release from somewhere in the UK just a couple of days ago that said, the headline said, "Climate change could cause half the world to lose access to clean water." And they're talking about using a 4-degree temperature rise. Well, guess what? A good portion of the world doesn't have access to clean water now. So we're talking a worsening of a bad situation. 900 million people are lacking access to clean drinking water, at least. 2.6 billion are lacking access to any kind of reasonable sanitation. That means that millions of people, including 1.5 million children under 5, die every year because of waterborne diseases. Much of the world is in the state that Portland was in before 1895. This is a foreign policy issue. I mean, we have to think, as a country, water is an economic driver here at home, but we also use virtual water. I mean, everything we import from around the globe, whether it's manufactured goods or food products, everything has water that goes into it. So not only do we use the most water on a day-to-day basis here in this country, just in our homes and our businesses, but if you think about the virtual water that we're pulling on from the rest of the world, it's an even bigger amount. And we need to think about that in terms of our global trade policy. We also need to think about the humanitarian aspects of, are we comfortable with the fact that so many people in the world don't have access to clean drinking water and sanitation when we can go spend a couple bucks for a few ounces of water. So even though it's not something we think about on a daily basis, we should be at least aware of those larger water issues. And that's just a smattering of some of the politics and water wars coming up. So here's the final word, I guess. We often take water for granted, especially when we have so many raindrops falling on our head like we do in Portland most of the time. But we do so at our peril. Our water future is not going to be like our water past. I mean, that's absolutely true. The details about it are a little more complicated. But it's going to be full of uncertainty, possible scarcity, competition, and drama. So think of that, the next time you raise your glass. Thank you.
The first question for our speaker, as always, will be from our Friday Forum host. Our host today is City Club Governor Pat McCormick. For 20 years, Pat was a partner at Conklin, Fiscum, and McCormick, a public affairs, research, and public relations firm. Now, Pat is a partner at AMPMPR, a public relations firm he recently founded with his daughter, Allison. Pat has been a City Club member since 1969. Pat?
Thank you, Charity. And thank you very much, Janet, for a revealing kind of walk through the thicket of water law and water politics. State policymakers are getting ready to convene in Salem in January, facing the daunting and dismal economy Oregon has unfortunately visited upon it this last few years. You mentioned in your presentation how important a role water plays in Oregon's economy. Do you have counsel for Oregon legislators about the most important policy issues they ought to be paying attention to regarding water resources in this upcoming legislative session?
Well, I'm happy to report that actually the water issues got a fair amount of attention last session for in many ways the first time. And the integrated water resources strategy process that's going on right now is one example of that. There were other attempts to to enforce a measurement requirement across the board on all Oregon water users. That did not get adopted by the legislature. There have been attempts in past sessions to talk about putting a price on water, when you get a water right from the state, that maybe you should actually pay for the water, not for the administrative fee of getting the water right. That often has not even gotten a hearing in past legislative sessions. So I think if I were in Salem or somewhere else right now, people would be throwing food at me for saying this, but I think that we should deal with the pricing issue. I think we need to talk about pricing signals being injected into the water system. That's a very controversial issue. But if you think about it, what do you need to live besides water, air, food, and a minimum of shelter and healthcare, right? Well, air is still free, mostly. Shelter and food and healthcare are not. And yet, so we charge for those things. I mean, we charge for food. Why don't we charge for water? Now, obviously, you need to make accommodations for people who can't afford to buy food or to pay for water as well. But the idea that water is somehow different, I mean, it is different because it is inherently a public resource. It's more like air than like food, perhaps. But we need to start facing the pricing issue. The policy issues we're working on in the current state water planning process are some of the big ones. I mean, do we need more storage? Do we need more conservation? How do we protect in-stream flows while also allowing for economic development? Where do we get the money to do any of this stuff? I would like to say that there will be more federal stimulus money that we could use for water development projects. I don't think that's going to be the case, so we may have missed the boat. We did get a fair amount for some water treatment, water quality projects. We didn't really get any for water quantity projects. So I think the issue of pricing, the issue of measurement, and then continuing to hammer out how we're going to keep everybody happy to some degree with water are the big issues.
We will now take questions from the floor. As you remember, asking questions at Friday Forums is a privilege of membership. Please, before asking your question, identify yourself as a City Club member, and remember to ask a question in 30 seconds or less. And if you don't, I will hold up the question mark and to make sure I follow Ted's strong tradition. So, next question.
Steve Shale, member. Janet, thanks for coming. 3 questions for a current scholar who is a former politician administrator. A lot of questions. Are the minimum stream flow laws in place working now? Are the critical groundwater law, is it working now? And how are we functioning with the watershed councils? How do you see those from your point of view after spending that time in Salem and now looking at it as a scholar?
Those are three really big questions. Okay, the first two, I think that the short answer is no, that neither the minimum stream flow protections nor the appreciation of groundwater surface water connections are necessarily working. And this is not because of bad intent or maliciousness or anything else. It's trying to move a more than 100-year-old system in a direction of new understanding. So, the original system of water use in Oregon, like the rest of the West, was built around get that water out of the stream and make it do something useful economically. Irrigate, mine, manufacture, drink, whatever. And it was later when we realized the consequences of drying up the stream beds. So in the 1950s, Oregon put in a minimum stream flow law. By the 1950s, a whole lot of the water rights were already handed out. So, you're starting behind. In 1987, the legislature adopted an in-stream water rights law to try to strengthen the minimum stream flow law. The one piece of the in-stream water rights law that can be useful in putting water back in streams is the idea that you can actually buy or lease or somehow get hold of a senior water right. Because remember I said the senior water right is the important thing. The in-stream flow law allows people to either donate, sell, or lease senior water rights and then have them protected with their senior priority dates. You can donate those back in stream. That was the purpose of forming the Oregon Water Trust. That program has now been merged with the Freshwater Trust. That's what we try to do. We try to go buy water rights from consumptive users, put them back in stream, and protect them as in-stream flows. So that's kind of where the rubber hits the road on the minimum stream flows. Because in 1950, when they said, okay, all these streams should have minimum stream flows, some of them were already fully appropriated. So how are you going to get the water back in except by buying back some of the water rights? Groundwater, surface water, the state does try to connect the two. And part of the reason it doesn't work is because we don't have full information about the connection. And because history, again, was one step behind, or more than one step behind, scientific knowledge, or the law was behind scientific knowledge. So originally, there was one system for surface water management, and the groundwater was considered occult. I mean, that's in, that word is in old cases. It was occult and mysterious. We didn't know what it was doing. So out of sight, out of mind, had a whole different management. Then, once you've already put a whole bunch of laws and water rights in place, trying to then say, oops, now we need to connect these two, it's very hard. So we haven't accomplished that yet. And then finally, I'm realizing I'm blanking on this question because it was the hardest one. Watershed councils. These are a tremendous institution because what it does is it brings issues back down to the local basin or watershed level and forces people to sort of sit down in a room with irrigators, municipal suppliers, business development, economic development, conservation groups, and everybody to say, okay, what are our major water problems? Most watershed councils are advisory only, and they don't have management authority. So I think we still haven't quite found a way for them to fully integrate into the rest of the management system, but in many places they've done some incredible restoration work and incredible consensus building. But it's kind of a one-off situation. Some of them are good, some of them haven't been so successful, but it's still something worth doing because it focuses people on their local water issues.
Peter Pincel, City Club member. I'm actually a 2009 graduate of Lewis and Clark undergraduate, and I just did my thesis on the water scarcity issue in the southwestern United States and economic solutions to mitigating it. And so my question is, 80% of the water is appropriated to agricultural use. Now, is it also used by agricultural use? And because I've touched bases with it being used in inefficient ways, just because it's appropriated and then got to use it or it's going to get taken away, and there's more money to be made off of a cheap product like cotton or something that's not really needed. You might as well use it if you got it. So my question is there a way to maybe, so as an economics major, I'm all about optimal resource allocation and shifting it around. Is there something on the books for transferring water around between priorly appropriated members? How mature is the water market here in Oregon? And yeah, sorry.
Okay, very good questions. And I'll start at the end maybe, there are mechanisms to transfer, besides just the in-stream water rights law, which I mentioned, there are other mechanisms for water rights to be traded around. In order to do so, you have to get the permission of the state, and you go through a process to review if it's going to cause injury to other users. That is, and this recognizes that water is a common resource, and one person may be diverting water and using it a certain way, putting a certain amount back in the stream. Somebody else may be using that exact return flow from the previous user. So changing, selling the water, the upper diverter's water right, either for another use or another place or another season, any of those kinds of things, is going to have an impact on other water users on that same system. The state administrative process is designed to try to mitigate that injury, but it's very cumbersome, and as a result, not just as a result of the cumbersomeness of the system, but partly as a result of that, and partly because Oregon has had more water than the Southwest for a long time. So no, we don't have a very developed water market in Oregon. It's really just started in the last few years. I mean, to pick up in the last few years, a lot of it is moving towards these ecological uses as opposed to competing consumptive uses. Back to the first part of your question, absolutely there is inefficiency in not just agricultural water use, but all water use, and that's what I meant by this untapped potential. 80% of the consumptive use of water in the state goes to agriculture. A lot of that is only used at maybe 50, 60% efficiency. So, but again, the inefficient water use then puts return flows back in the stream that somebody else depends on for their supply. So it's very tricky to get in and start pulling apart those pieces of the bundle. But that's part of what we have to do to become more efficient overall. We can't just say, oh, we're all using return flow. We can't improve efficiency because it's going to mess everybody up. We have to be a little bit more precise about what's going on.
Hi, Janet. Bob DeVee, City Club member. Could you comment a little more specifically on what's going on downstate with the Klamath River Basin and what seems to be kind of a percolating water war down there?
Yes, and in fact, I would say it was more than percolating a few years ago. The Klamath is a perfect example of things that have happened all around the West particularly, but around the country as well, in that you have a situation where more water has been handed out than the system can sustainably support. You had, the Klamath Basin is a very arid area, but you had the Bureau of Reclamation coming in the early 1900s, developing one of the first reclamation projects, encouraging people to farm there, giving out irrigation water. Meanwhile, Indian tribes with superior water rights in terms of the law weren't being protected. And then, of course, you have the Endangered Species Act coming in, or you have the issue of endangered species. It also happens to be protected by the Endangered Species Act, calling attention to the fact that when you divert a whole lot of water out of the system, you hurt the bald eagle refuges, you hurt the fish, you hurt the in-stream uses. And at the same time, the Klamath is also a basin where a lot of efficiency improvements could be made. But I would say that because of some of the kind of blunt ways that controversy came to a head back in 2001 and continues to be controversial, people have had a hard time then backing off their positions and feeling attacked and sitting down and saying, okay, how much, what can we do with the natural water supplies in the Klamath Basin? Can we support the level of irrigated agriculture and the wildlife refuges and the fish species and the tribes, or does something have to give? And the real fact of the matter in the Klamath is that something has to give because there isn't enough. Yes.
Sorry. We have run out of time for further questions and we'll have to stop for the day. Join us next week to learn about Oregon forests as our speakers discuss if Oregon's forests are an old key that can open a path to the new economy. As we close, please join me in expressing our appreciation to today's guest, Janet Neuman. We are adjourned.